Welcome back to Red Horizons. Last episode we stood at the edge of a new world. In Red Mars, the colonists carved out the bones of a future. Fractured, contested, but still possible. But possibility is not liberation. And as Green Mars opens, we find ourselves in the shadows of a failed uprising. The dust has settled, the dead are buried, and beneath the surface, something stirs again. This isn't peace, it's preparation. In this episode, Revolution on the Red Planet, we trace the arc of resistance on Mars as it ignites into full-scale rebellion. From scattered survivors rebuilding in exile to alliances forged in secret, Green Mars is a study in revolutionary process. Not a single spark, but a terrain of friction, of fear, strategy, betrayal, and hope. To guide us through this terrain, we turn to the thinkers who've mapped revolution from below. Silvia Federici shows us how labor, especially hidden reproductive labor, lays the groundwork for rebellion. Cedric Robinson reminds us that resistance isn't born in theory, but in culture, memory, and everyday refusal. Rodney exposes the brutal machinery of empire and the costs of collapse. And Amílcar Cabral speaks to what comes after, the painful, necessary work of decolonization and rebuilding. Green Mars is not a fantasy of clean revolutions. It's a mirror held to our own world, its empires, its betrayals, its buried dreams of something free. This is revolution not as an event, but as a process, uncertain, unfinished, and utterly necessary. The seeds of uprising, discipline, labor, and the slow burn of discontent. Revolutions don't appear fully formed. They emerge in fragments, in quiet refusals, in the relentless repetition of unjust labor. In Green Mars, long before the first summit is bombed or the first dome falls, we're immersed in the subterranean rhythms of discontent. The Great Rebellion is not sparked in a single moment. It's cultivated over time, in soil rich with suffering and imagination. Silvia Federici reminds us that the foundations of any revolutionary movement are laid not just in the factories and fields, but in the kitchens, nurseries, and supply lines. In the places capitalism declares apolitical, unpaid, or invisible. This is the labor that sustains life. And on Mars, life itself is a fragile, artificial construct. There's no nature to fall back on, no wilderness to retreat into. Everything must be built, maintained, and monitored. Air, water, temperature, every breath is political. And so the Martian colonists, scattered and recovering from the catastrophic suppression of the first revolution at the end of Red Mars, began again, but not as they were. Hidden in remote refuges and deep canyons, they rebuild in the margins. But this time, they build with memory. Federici's emphasis on reproductive labor allows us to see the hidden currents beneath the surface of green Mars. The caretaking, the teaching, the cultivation of food, the tending of bodies. All of this is resistance when done outside the mandates of Earth. When the infrastructure of daily life is no longer tied to profit or production, but to survival, dignity, and autonomy, it becomes a threat to power. We see this in the scattered communes where survivors of the first 100 labored to keep each other alive. There are no leaders, no titles, no wages, only necessity and commitment. They build consensus slowly, sometimes painfully. They disagree, they fail, and still they persist. But even these acts of survival are monitored. Earth's corporate representatives view all unauthorized habitation as deviant. Everything from unsanctioned algae growth to informal childcare is seen as a disruption to control. And so, even without direct confrontation, the colonists are forced into resistance simply by living outside of Earth's command structures. And here is where the slow burn begins. Not with declarations or manifestos, but with long days spent retrofitting greenhouses, with nights filled with whispered histories of the first revolt, with parents telling their children not just bedtime stories, but counter-histories of how the old domes fell, of how the old dreams were buried, and how new ones might still bloom. Federici's lens demands that we take seriously the quiet labor of world building, that we recognize that the Martian Revolution is not only forged in militant struggle, but in the steady, grueling work of holding a fractured society together. In moments that would seem apolitical to an outsider, sharing water rations, repairing a failed oxygenator, teaching children how to survive without Earth, we see the actual substance of resistance. And of course, this resistance is not unified. There are tensions between reds and greens, between radicals and pragmatists, between those who want independence at any cost and those who believe cooperation with Earth is still possible. But these conflicts are signs of a living movement, one that's not yet revolutionary in name, but already revolutionary in form. What makes Green Mars so compelling is that it refuses to grant revolution the purity of myth. It reminds us that uprisings are messy, contradictory, and born of exhaustion as much as hope. The settlers are not heroes. They're tired, injured, traumatized people trying to build something in the cracks left by collapse. And in these cracks, something new is forming. The political awakening of Mars does not come from theory. It comes from doing, from repairing the systems that Earth has abandoned or sabotaged, from refusing to participate in exploitation, even when it's easier, from seeing that survival itself under these conditions is resistance, and that resistance, when organized, becomes revolution. We end this segment not with an explosion, but with a whisper, with the quiet certainty that change is coming, because under every greenhouse, in every co-op and safe house, Martians are beginning to realize they are no longer Earth's colonists. There's something else now. Memory, culture, and the birth of revolutionary consciousness. Revolutions are not only born from material deprivation, they're also born from memory, from the stories a people choose to tell, and from the silences they refuse to maintain. In Green Mars, the roots of resistance stretch far beneath the surface of the planet, fed not only by political urgency, but by a shared cultural memory forged in exile. The revolutionary consciousness that emerges here is not spontaneous. It's cultivated, it's curated, and it's radical because it remembers. After the crushing of the uprising in Red Mars, the surviving members of the First Hundred are scattered across the Martian wilderness. Some retreat into the most remote canyons and craters, hidden from surveillance. Others embed themselves within new settlements, under assumed identities, watching and waiting. The rebellion has failed, or so it appears, but its memory has not. And in that memory, something begins to smolder. This is where Cedric Robinson becomes essential to our analysis. In his theory of the Black radical tradition, Robinson asserts that revolutionary movements among oppressed peoples don't arise primarily from formal ideology. They emerge from collective historical experience, from centuries of resistance encoded in music, ritual, spirituality, oral history, and cultural survival. In other words, culture is not an accessory to revolution, it's its seedbed. On Mars, this tradition is not black in the specific historical sense Robinson explored, but it is radical in the same way. It's the product of a people forging identity through the continuity of struggle. The Martians, no longer just Earth-born scientists and settlers, are slowly becoming something else. Not a nation, not a race, but a new kind of people, defined by their shared conditions and oppositions. And that peoplehood is not built through statecraft. It's built through culture. Robinson reminds us that the dominant frameworks of revolutionary theory, Marxism, anarchism, socialism, aren't wrong, but they're incomplete without attention to the embedded, lived practices of resistance. In Green Mars, this manifests in the underground education networks run by the First Hundred. Children born on Mars are taught more than survival. They're taught history, but not the sanitized version fed through Earth's corporate data streams. They're taught the story of the uprising, of Hiroko Ai's agro-communes, of Arkady Bogdanov's refusal to obey, of sabotage, betrayal, and the price of defiance. They're also taught Earth's history, the real one. They learn about slavery, colonization, revolution, climate collapse. They're raised with a political vocabulary that prepares them to see their world not as natural, but as constructed, and therefore subject to change. This is where resistance becomes generational. Political consciousness in Green Mars is deeply tied to identity, and identity itself becomes a political act. We see this in the use of language, how Martian-born youth develop their own dialects, their own idioms, rejecting Earth's naming systems. We see it in ritual, in song, in the cultivation of Mars-native plant life. Even aesthetics, fashion, architecture, communal organization become signifiers of a separate Martian identity. This is more than cultural pride. It's political strategy. Because as long as Martians see themselves as outposts of Earth, rebellion will always seem like treason. But if they begin to see themselves as a distinct people, rebellion becomes self-defense. Here again, Robinson is instructive. He argued that black radicalism arose not by mimicking European revolutionary thought, but by carrying forward distinct traditions of resistance, by centering the lived experience of oppression and the spiritual and cultural tools developed to survive it. Likewise, Martian revolution does not need to imitate Earth's ideological battles. It invents its own. We see this most clearly in the development of parallel institutions, underground clinics, autonomous farms, communications networks independent of Earth satellites. These are not mere gestures. They're experiments in autonomy. They train people not only to resist, but to live differently. Revolutionary consciousness is not a switch flipped in a single moment. It's a collective process, forged in the tension between memory and desire. The exiled Martians remember what was lost, what was taken, and what might still be possible. And through that remembrance, they begin to develop what the Marxist theorist Ernst Bloch called the principle of hope, not as a naive optimism, but as a grounded refusal to accept the present as inevitable. The revolution then doesn't begin with violence. It begins in the mind, in the stories told around underground campfires, in the lessons passed between generations, in the recognition that survival under domination is not enough. And this new consciousness spreads, not as dogma, but as rhythm, as a whisper, as a vibration in the airlock walls. The settlers begin to imagine not just rebellion, but replacement. Not just resistance, but redefinition. They're not a colony, they're a people. And that realization changes everything. Collapse, insurgency, and the breaking of empire. Every system imagines itself eternal until the moment it cracks. In Green Mars, the crack comes with a series of coordinated attacks. The corporate summit, meant to demonstrate Earth's control over its most ambitious colony, instead becomes a moment of rupture. Protest turns to sabotage. Sabotage turns to open insurrection. And Mars, long treated as a distant resource extraction zone, becomes a battlefield. But this is not chaos. It's choreography. Years of underground organizing, of clandestine communication, of quiet alliance building, now erupt into motion. What seemed spontaneous is, in fact, the fruit of careful, risky labor. The resistance has been practicing revolution beneath the surface for years. Now it rises. This is the moment Walter Rodney helps us understand. In his foundational work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Rodney exposes the logic of imperial control, not just through violence or corruption, but through systemic underdevelopment. The colonies were not poor by accident. They were made poor, designed to serve, not thrive. And in that enforced dependency, rebellion always simmers. Mars, too, has been systematically underdeveloped by Earth's transnational corporations. Its infrastructure, designed for extraction, is built to serve Earth's needs, not Martian autonomy. Even the science, ostensibly neutral, is subsumed by capital. Every innovation is owned, every discovery patented, every ecosystem mapped for profit. What Rodney makes clear is that the underdevelopment is not an economic condition. It's a political weapon, and when wielded too bluntly, it shatters. The Martian rebellion is not only a reaction to exploitation, it's a revolt against the lie that exploitation is inevitable, against the enforced narrative that Mars must always be dependent, always be subordinate, always be a client of a distant power. The resistance in Green Mars declares that there is another path, that Mars can become something Earth fears: autonomous, self-determining, and revolutionary. And yet this uprising is not utopia. It's messy, fragmented, riven by disagreement. There's no single revolutionary party, no unified manifesto. The movement is composed of factions, eco-radicals who reject all terraforming, pragmatic engineers who want Martian independence without full ecological rupture, socialists advocating communal governance, and anarchists building networks of mutual aid. These aren't flaws, they're the reality of revolution. Rodney's analysis reminds us that revolutions are shaped as much by what they reject as by what they propose. The common enemy, Earth's imperial control, unites for a moment, but the deeper questions remain unsolved. Who will govern Mars? How will resources be shared? Will old hierarchies be replicated in new colors? And yet, despite these tensions, the uprising achieves the unthinkable. It breaks Earth's illusion of total control. The summit is overrun. Domes are seized. Strategic nodes are disabled. Earth's military response, swift and brutal, is less effective than intended. The old levers of power don't pull as cleanly. This is the moment revolutionaries dream of and dread. Because when the old order collapses, what comes next is not peace, it's uncertainty. Rodney understood that the fall of empire does not guarantee justice. In fact, it often creates a vacuum, one that reactionaries, opportunists, and former elites rush to fill. In Green Mars, Robinson does not shy away from this danger. We see the initial victory of the resistance quickly threatened by infighting, confusion, and the sheer logistical nightmare of planetary transformation. The Martians must now govern what they've seized. They have to distribute air, water, medicine. They have to negotiate new alliances. And all of this while Earth continues to loom in orbit, still powerful, still armed, still watching. But in that chaos, there's also clarity. For the first time in the trilogy, we see a genuine break, a refusal, a possibility. The revolutionary moment is not the end of the struggle. It's the beginning of the responsibility. The seizure of power is not the conclusion. It's the test. And Green Mars gives us no easy answers. It gives us something harder. The truth that revolution is not an abstract ideal, but a living process. It's made by people, flawed, frightened, determined, working through contradictions, improvising in crisis, holding fast to vision even as the ground shifts beneath them. Rodney's legacy echoes here. He warned that post-colonial nations would be tempted to replicate the systems they overthrew, that without structural change, independence would be symbolic, not substantive. And on Mars, that question now looms. Will the new society repeat the old hierarchies, or will it invent something new? The first act was destruction, the second must be creation. And this act is where the real struggle begins. After the fire, decolonization, reconstruction, and the weight of liberation. Revolution is not the end. It's the opening act of a longer, harder struggle. Green Mars ends not with triumph, but with transition. The rebellion has ruptured Earth's grip, but what follows is not utopia, it's uncertainty. The old order has fallen, but the new one has yet to be born. The Martians are not just survivors now. They're caretakers of something unfinished, something fragile, something that might yet fail. It's here that we turn to Amílcar Cabral, the revolutionary theorist and anti-colonial leader who understood perhaps more deeply than most what comes after liberation. In his writings and speeches during the struggle against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau, Cabral emphasized that true liberation could not be reduced to the replacement of foreign rulers with local ones. Real decolonialization, he said, required a total transformation of structures, of values, of culture. The people must not only seize power, they must remake themselves. This insight resonates profoundly in Green Mars. With Earth's presence weakened and local resistance triumphant, the question becomes, what now? The revolutionaries quickly discover that winning a war does not mean knowing how to govern. Each faction carries its own vision. Hiroko Ai's eco-spiritualist followers believe in total integration with the Martian biosphere. Nadia and the engineers prioritize infrastructure, survival, and coordination. Others push for constitutional government, for syndicalist networks, for anarchist federation. No single ideology prevails, nor should it. But the lack of unity is not merely a challenge of logistics, it's a challenge of identity. Who are the Martians now? What binds them together beyond shared opposition to Earth? Cabral insisted that post-colonial societies must not attempt to replicate the political and economic forms of the colonizer. Instead, they must recover and cultivate indigenous forms of organization, those rooted in the people's own history, geography, and values. On Mars, this means rejecting Earth's nation-state model. It means experimenting with something new, something suited to a planet without borders, without nations, without precedent. And yet the ghosts of Earth are everywhere. Corporate habits linger. Technocratic authority threatens to reassert itself. The pull toward hierarchy is strong, especially when survival depends on functioning systems. Cabral warned of this. He spoke of the class suicide that revolutionary leaders must commit, the shedding of ego, privilege, and inherited authority in service of collective transformation. Without this, he argued, revolutions decay into replicas of the regimes they overthrew. We see this tension in Green Mars. The revolutionary leaders are not saints. They're scientists, radicals, survivors. They argue, they compromise. Some grasp for control, while others withdraw. And yet, in the midst of all of this, we witness something remarkable, an open process, a willingness to debate, to delay, to avoid the rush to centralization. The Constitutional Congress scene becomes emblematic. Delegates from across the planet gather not to crown a ruler, but to draft a process, a framework for ongoing negotiation. This is not a declaration of independence. It's a commitment to interdependence, to mutual responsibility, to the long work of building a just world without blueprints. Cabral called this re-Africanization of the mind, a way of decolonizing not just political structures, but ways of thinking, the shaping of a people to fit not the constraints of history, but the possibilities of their environment, to build not atop the ruins of empire, but alongside the rhythms of the land. Even the planet itself resists easy narratives. The terraforming process continues, contested and uncontrolled. Some valleys bloom, others freeze, storms rage, landscapes shift. In a sense, Mars itself is a metaphor for revolution, not linear, not teleological, but dynamic, evolving. And that's the lesson Green Mars offers as its closing note, that revolution is not a destination, but a condition, that decolonization is not an event, but a horizon, always approaching, always deferred, always demanding renewed commitment. Amílcar Cabral didn't live to see the full independence of his people, but his vision endures, not as dogma, but as a compass. And through his lens, we can see the Martian struggle for what it is, not the culmination of rebellion, but its continuation. This time, with the even greater burden of freedom. The revolution on Mars begins in whispers and ends in rupture. But it really doesn't end. In Green Mars, Kim Stanley Robinson doesn't give us an ideal revolution. He gives us a real one, chaotic, uneven, incomplete. He shows us that rebellion is not a single event, but a process unfolding across decades, across landscapes, across identities. And through that process, we see the truth, that liberation is not something handed down from above, it's built from below, in labor, in memory, in rupture, and in rebuilding. We followed Silvia Federici through the hidden power of reproductive labor. We moved with Cedric Robinson through the radical continuity of culture. We watched the empire crack through Walter Rodney's lens of underdevelopment and systemic resistance. And we stood at the uncertain edge of revolution with Amílcar Cabral, asking not only how to win, but how to begin again. This is what makes Green Mars such an urgent text for our time. It demands that we not only imagine the moment of rebellion, but that we prepare for what follows. The hard part, the part no one trains you for, the part where you must not only survive empire, but build something beyond it. Because whether on Earth or Mars, revolution is never the end. It's the first breath of something else, something we have to build together. Today we followed the arc of Green Mars, from the slow burn of discontent to the fire of revolution and into the uncertain light of liberation. We examine the uprising not as a singular event, but as a collective process shaped by labor, memory, violence, and vision. A revolution made not by heroes, but by people, flawed, resilient, and determined to build something better. Next time we conclude our journey through the Martian trilogy with Blue Mars, and we ask, what does it mean to govern a new world? What happens when revolution becomes policy? And how do we imagine freedom across generations, across cultures, and across the stars? Until then, stay sharp, stay critical, and don't stop imagining something better. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Red Horizons. If you found value in today's exploration, please consider sharing the podcast with comrades, friends, and fellow travelers. Every download, every mention, every spark of conversation helps keep this project alive. If you'd like to support the show directly, you can find us on Patreon at Red Horizons Pod. For questions, comments, or revolutionary reading suggestions, email us at redhorizonspod@protime.me. Red Horizons is written and hosted by Steve McPhail. Original music by Parker Kent.